Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Wilson Center is delighted to collaborate with the Hunt Alternatives Fund on this and subsequent seminars on the issue of human trafficking. The Wilson Center commends Ambassador Swanee Hunt and her colleagues for their leadership in helping to develop a series of lectures on the subject, delving especially into the demand side of human trafficking equation. This is the inaugural event of this series. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Center. Lee Hamilton, President and Director of the Center, could not be here for the start of this meeting. Lee was in Fort Worth last night for an event for the Wilson Center and is on his way back to Washington as we speak. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is a national living memorial honoring President Woodrow Wilson. In providing an essential link between the worlds of ideas and public policy, the Center addresses current and future challenges confronting our nation and the world. The Center promotes policy-relevant research and dialogue to increase understanding and be instrumental in enhancing the capabilities and knowledge of leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. Created by an act of Congress in 1968, the Center is a nonpartisan institution supported by both public and private funds. In seeking to bring a wide spectrum of people together to discuss critical issues of the day, we have the confident hope that from their dialogue on public policy issues, participants can learn from each other, the work of all will be enriched, and better understanding and better policy can emerge. Through close to 800 meetings a year, in the presence of over 150 scholars during the course of a year, the Center's work and scholarship commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. This meeting today is very much in the Wilsonian tradition, bringing together practitioners and scholars for an informed exchange on what is clearly an underexplored public policy issue. I would also like to welcome our panelists and thank you very much for being here. For those of you who found out about today's events from our emails, you are on the database. For those who've found out about this event otherwise, please sign up outside to receive notice of future events in this important series. It is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Allison Garland, who will help introduce the panel. Thank you again for being here. I know you'll have a productive session.
Hi, welcome. I'm Allison Garland of the Comparative Urban Studies Project here at the Wilson Center. As Mike Van Dusen said, this meeting is the first in a collaborative project of the Hunt Alternatives Fund and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Over the next year, we will be organizing a working group and a series of public events to examine the demand dynamics of sex trafficking. Our goal is to raise public awareness of commercial sexual exploitation, a form of modern-day slavery, and to highlight policies and best practices that reduce demand for sex trafficking. I would like to welcome now Ambassador Swanee Hunt, President of the Hunt Alternatives Fund, who will be moderating today's session. She is the Eleanor Roosevelt Lecturer in Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She also chairs the Institute for Inclusive Security, which conducts research, training, and advocacy to integrate women into peace processes. She served as President Clinton's ambassador to Austria from 1993 to 1997, hosting negotiations focused on stabilizing neighboring Balkan states. Ambassador Hunt holds 2 master's degrees, a doctorate in theology, and 6 honorary degrees. And as Mike mentioned, we have complete biographies for all of our panelists outside on the table. Ambassador Hunt has been instrumental in drawing attention to the issue of modern-day slavery, and we would like to thank her for involving the Wilson Center in her effort to raise awareness about the far-reaching effects of sex trafficking and to bring attention to policies that work to eradicate the demand for commercial sex. We would also like to thank Lena Nealon, manager of the Modern Slavery Project at the Hunt Alternatives Fund, and Lauren Herzer of the Wilson Center for their work to make this event possible. Now I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Ambassador Hunt, and we'll also make another effort to bring everybody in the room if anybody's still trying to get in from the outside.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll go see you.
Great. Well, if this isn't a statement, congratulations to you all for coming. You are part of a movement. Is that chair empty? Aha, we have an empty chair. We have an empty chair right there. Okay, and here's a chair right here. Okay, good. All right, I'm Swanee Hunt, as you know. Oh, there was my former deputy from Austria. How great to see you. Thank you, thank you. Now, we're going to talk here not about all kinds of slavery, because if you take out the debt bondage in India, 80% of the modern-day slavery is actually women and children in the sex field. So those of you who are interested in other sorts, labor, slavery, and others, I don't want you to think that that's not critical, that's not extraordinarily important. It's just we're trying to focus here on one sliver, because the response to one, the public policy response to one, is not the same as a public policy response to another. So that's our thinking here. I started working on this problem in '97, writing a piece for Foreign Affairs about what was happening in Eastern Europe with women being brought over into the West. And so it's been a very pressing concern for me for a long time. And thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Linda, you were mentioned earlier, and Lauren. When I spoke with Lee Hamilton about this and said, what do you think? Are you interested in this whole field? He said, absolutely, it's critical. And he was so impassioned that I actually asked him the third time we were speaking, I said, Lee, is there something in your life that makes you particularly sensitive to this? And he said, no, it's not that. It is that this is a travesty, and this policy community is not recognizing it, and we need to be involved. So that's the basis of our being here today. A little bit of background. Slavery is more prevalent now than it has been in history. Kevin Bales, who, as you know, is a sociologist, says that 27 million people are enslaved worldwide, which is larger than 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. Isn't that an extraordinary way to think of it? I mean, I always have thought, where was my grandmother and my grandfather and my great-grandmother? Well, how could they have stood to be alive in that time and not doing something? And then I realized, here we are. Here we are. DOJ, Department of Justice, says that this is the fastest growing criminal industry, and human trade will surpass the drug trade in less than 5 years. Now, we get into this whole question about the use of the word trafficking. I think the word trafficking is actually a problem at this point, because people assume that means you're moving people across borders, and that is how we started using it for some logical reasons. Actually, now what we're talking about is the state of being exploited. And you can take someone from Roxbury and take her to Cambridge, and we're calling that trafficking. Frankly, you can take someone from the next room and bring her into here, and we're going to call that trafficking, because the dynamic is not different. It's a power relationship in which someone feels like usually he, but that person has the right to exploit a vulnerable person using their body for sale. So the victims are not just women and girls, they are boys, they are men, but basically we have to think of this as victimization of women and children. And I know that there are some exceptions, but we're not going to get stuck on that. Let me say one thing about the arguments that go on. I am not unfamiliar with the arguments that go on about the sex industry. We need to grant dignity. We need to legalize. We need to have health care checks. Let's not marginalize these people. Let them register. Let them pay taxes, etc. So I'm going to leave it, I think, to the next three speakers to address that in some ways. But I want to acknowledge that there are some real differences of opinion about how to go about dealing with this. The important good news is that we're all going for the same aim, which is social justice and dignity. So we have different ideas about how to get there. You're going to hear some of those different ideas today. Before we go on, I want to tell you one comment that I heard from an FBI agent. He was talking to a pimp and said to the pimp, "So how do you operate?" And the pimp said, "Well, I go to a mall and I find a girl and I say to her, 'You have beautiful eyes.' And if she says, 'Thank you,' then I walk away. And if I go to a girl and say, 'You have beautiful eyes,' and she looks down at her feet and she says, 'No, I don't,' I know I've got her." I am very much looking forward to hearing from three experts here today who've been working and thinking about this for years. What is this dynamic here? We're not talking about rescuing children from brothels. God bless the people who do that. Those beds are refilled like that in a nanosecond, which is why I'm focusing on the whole question of why are there these brothels? Why the hell are we tolerating this industry? And how can we get it from the demand end, if you think economics, supply and demand? I want to know what you're interested in today. Could I have 3 or 4 of you tell me why you came, what you're hoping to get from this? You're important people taking important time. Yes. And who are you? And stand up, please.
I'm the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and what I came for is what you have just introduced.
Good. So we're on target here.
The indication of a point of view that you have just put forward.
Okay. Thank you. All right. And yes.
My name is Kay Nino, and I'm here to fight human trafficking, to fight sex trafficking. I've been in Washington, D.C. for 2 hours. I'm looking to meet all of you and encourage all of you and say thank you and to see where I fit into the picture and how I can help and how I can bring all of my family and friends to help as well.
What's your background?
I was a community college teacher for 10 years.
Great.
Writer. I've been a
Wonderful.
farmer down in the Caribbean. And I've been reading about human trafficking, and now I'm ready to work.
That's fabulous, because teaching and educating is a big, big part of this whole demand picture. So I hope our panelists will address that. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Anna Leong, and I run a business that sells products that are made by survivors of sex trafficking. So basically my business provides economic empowerment for these women. I sell mainly conference bags and fundraising bags, and the point of this, of my business is to prevent slavery through commerce. We provide social justice with our products, and we provide a dignified living for these women so they won't be at risk for re-traffic back into brothels or bonded labor. So if you guys are interested in having conference bags or fundraising opportunities, let me know. I donate 15% of my proceeds to IJM, International Justice Mission.
So you came here to market.
Well, not just that.
There's nothing wrong with
Listen, that is completely legitimate. Okay, you're doing great work. Okay, all right. So yes, one last.
My name is Nikita Desai, and I'm here on behalf of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. I personally have done human trafficking research in Mongolia and talked to victims and talked to sex workers who've been trafficked. One of the things that I found in my work is that there was maybe not enough collaboration between different agencies. I think this forum is an excellent way to promote that and promote that dialogue. But not only is that we don't look at demand, and we don't look at demand seriously, we do look at prevention. There's a lot of other things taking place. But this is a really important way to look at demand and try to combat the demand for trafficking.
Excellent. And does everyone have copies of the bios? I hope. So I'm expecting that you all are going to make all kinds of connections in that respect. Now, your comments have now informed our panelists, and let me introduce them to you. I'll describe each one to you. Do you all have the bios of the speakers too? Well, I don't want to say, I'm not going to say things that then you already have in there. Let me just say that Victor spoke last night in our home to about 50 or 60 people in Cambridge, and you will end up on fire after you hear him. For better or for worse, you're going to be fired up. Does everyone know that he wrote the book The Natashas, and that actually had foreign policy ripples that I hope that he'll talk about? And the same thing is going to happen with the Johns. If you don't have the Johns, get it, but don't read it right before you go to sleep at night. Okay? He's a good guy. Speaking of, Linda Smith, you know that she was in the U.S. Congress and heads up Shared Hope International. She is a deep soul. She is a tireless advocate and worker, and I'm particularly glad that she's here because she can think about the Hill and the role of the U.S. Congress among other parts of our government. And Mark, you've been heading the Interagency Council, weren't you, on this subject? There isn't anybody who can talk public policy better than Mark Lagon. And you know that he's now heading Polaris, which is this very important NGO. But I think that while you may be talking some from that perspective, you'll mostly be talking about your work at the State Department as the ambassador at large. So, wow, glad you're here. You have one of the most dynamic three people you could possibly have to speak to you about this. No. I'll sit right.
Okay, good.
Yep, you're up.
Over the past decade and a half, we've had a lot of alarm bells being set off around the world, on the globe, about an ongoing human rights disaster. We've had report after report talking about the vast numbers of women and children and people who are being trafficked around the world, the vast majority, again, being women who are trafficked into the sex trade. What we're looking at in that case is what is being trafficked into foreign destinations. We're not even looking at the millions who are trafficked internally, domestically, in their own home countries. In that time, in this decade and a half, most nations around the world have enacted laws to deal with this horrific situation. But the sad reality is that the traffic continues to flourish unabated, and that's because the tough new laws are not being enforced in most countries. In the majority of nations on the planet, from the top echelons of power to a lowly cop on the beat, the trafficking of destitute women and girls into prostitution has not registered as a priority. And that's largely because men have been dragging their Neanderthal knuckles on familiar ground rather than charging into the fray and trying to put the brakes on this insanity. There are a myriad reasons for the explosion of the worldwide flesh trade, and they come out in all the books and all the studies. Extreme poverty, government corruption, the involvement of organized crime, the internet, the patriarchal darkness in which much of society is still entrenched, the ever-increasing demand by men for paid sex, and the alarming moves by more and more nations to legalize prostitution. So then what's behind this explosion in the international and domestic trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation? And on the surface, there's really no complicated or complex answer. It's very simple. The ingredients are a caustic mix of extreme poverty, criminal greed, and the perverted sex drives of men. And this despicable flesh trade continues to flourish because of the widespread subjugation of women in much of the world. And this is reflected day in and day out in society's continuing objectification and commodification of women. Yet rather than being seen as victims of untold human rights abuses, these women and girls are accused of venturing out with eyes wide open to earn money the easy way, on their backs, in the so-called world's oldest profession. What I make clear where I speak, anywhere I speak, is this. It is not the world's oldest profession. It is the world's oldest oppression. Moreover, prostitution is not a career choice for the vast majority of women caught up in that trade. It is the ultimate act of desperation. These women are the ones, however, who are accused of going out and leading hapless men astray, of luring otherwise upstanding family men, businessmen, and community leaders into their webs of debauchery and deceit. Women are the ones who are stigmatized. They are labeled the prostitutes, the whores, the harlots, the sluts, the hoes, and men get benignly tagged as customers, clients, and Johns. Yet it is these very clients, these Johns, who are their oppressors. And that's because men are the users and abusers of women and girls caught up in the flesh trade. And the hard reality is that little will be done to stop the worldwide carnage until men start taking responsibility for their action, and until men realize that they are the problem and that this entire global sex calamity solely exists because of their duplicitous behavior. It is this staggering demand that is creating huge profits for criminal networks worldwide and incentives for traffickers, for pimps, for brothel owners to entrap more and more victims. It is demand that is fueling the explosion in the trafficking of women and girls worldwide. In the economic parlance, women are the commodity. They're the supply side of the coin. And embedded in the supply side of the coin are these factors: extreme poverty, lack of education, and the eternal yearning of desperate human beings to want to improve their lot in life. But you flip that coin and you get the demand side. And there's three key letters in demand: M-A-N. And without demand, you would have no supply. You cannot get simpler than that. This is Basic Economics 101. It would not be profitable for criminals to stay in this business if endless platoons and battalions of men weren't out there prowling the side streets for purchased sex. Male sex buyers who are willing to close their eyes and shell out $50 or $100 for a few minutes of physical bliss while they deepen the misery of women and girls. Yet most governments act as if demand by men for purchased sex is of little import. This is an area that is rife with cliches. They dismiss the nocturnal activities of men on the prowl for sex with prostituted women with glib comments like, "Boys are just being boys, they're sowing their wild oats." It's as if men have been given a special dispensation for being male, some sort of cultural, social, and biological right. And it's precisely these bizarre, entrenched attitudes that has led to this global-wide sex trade. All these crazy and widely accepted myths about men needing sex to release tension, the natural drive of men for sex, prostitution, protecting nice girls from rape, the rite of passage of initiating boys into manhood. In the deluded world of Johns, the list of mindless excuses goes on and on. I'm just a lonely guy, lonely and blue, so what am I going to do, you know? My wife has had 4 kids, let herself go. She's not really interested in sex anymore. Really? Look in the mirror, Jack. You're no gift. That's awesome. There's a single guy who's out there who doesn't want drama in his life. Or the guy who takes a young woman out on a date and says, "Oh, I just spent $200 on dinner. I'm supposed to get beyond first base." I mean, you have to wonder about that. There are the Johns who bemoan that they are not good looking, that they feel that they're over the hill and they deserve, want, and need the it girl. So they go to foreign countries or here and they spend a lot of money so that they can rent an 18-year-old. Then there are the Johns, and this is the really scary part because I have a chapter in the book called The Monster Woman. These are Johns and men who loathe Western women. They are men who are really the bottom feeders of the Neanderthal cesspool. They want to turn the clock back to a time when women were in the kitchen having babies and cooking meals for them and, you know, just do whatever they want. So many Johns also who go out today want and commit sexual acts that cannot be and will not be fulfilled within the socially accepted confines of their relationships with their wives and girlfriends. So they seek out prostituted women to fulfill their preferred sex drives. They do things to prostituted women that have nothing to do with sex, but everything to do with power, abuse, degradation, dehumanization. For them, prostituted women exist solely to be used and abused, dissected and fragmented, all for their sexual fantasies and their misogynistic tendencies. Johns feel that because they have cold hard cash, they can act with impunity because they know one important thing. If a prostituted woman yells rape, who's going to believe her in the system that we have set up today? She's not a victim, she is a perpetrator. But in reality, the vast majority of women are victims when you look at the circumstances that lead them to prostitution. For these men, it's all about power and control, and the sad reality is this is where a man's fantasy becomes a woman's terrifying reality. Bottom line, whether the John is passive, gentle, and he's flattering and brings her chocolates and flowers, or whether he's obnoxious, rude, and crude, or abusive, his treatment of the women he buys represents a complete denial of her existence as a human being. Her human soul, her self-worth, is never taken into consideration. In effect, what the buyer is paying for is the woman to be a non-entity. She is an object for sex and nothing more. And in the final analysis, the entire sexual experience in prostitution is totally male. It is the man who enjoys it. He enjoys the power of what money can buy. He enjoys the ego boost, the conquest, and the sexual gratification. And he gets to delude himself into believing that every moan and groan that emanates from the lips of the woman that he has rented is because of his magnetic masculinity. It is the man who convinces himself into thinking that because the woman accepts money, then everything is okay. Because payment for men is the ultimate conscience pacifier. He doesn't have to look into her eyes. He doesn't have to ask any questions. I gave you money, deliver. They believe because cold, hard cash has crossed palms, no harm, no rape has occurred. Some Johns who venture forth on sex tours to impoverished lands around the world go so far as to convince themselves that they are actually helping the women they rent for sex. They convince themselves that they are helping feed her family. For these men, for these miscreants, charity begins below the belt line. So many Johns defend their exploits by saying she didn't object, she didn't say no. They believe that silence is consent. And society blames these women for that silence without taking the time to understand the underlying reasons for it. It comes from intimidation and fear, abuse, torture, dissociation, and shame. Their silence, like the silence of the vast majority of battered women, should never be taken as consent. When I started looking into the world of Johns, I tried to figure out who are these guys? Who are the men who are driving this modern-day sex trade? Well, you'd be way off base to think that there's some kind of pervert sitting in a basement watching porn and then venturing out into the night. The clients are ordinary men, fathers, husbands, sons and brothers, CEOs, bank managers, lawyers, judges. You even have a Supreme Court judge from New York State who was the head of the Jesters Society Entertainment Committee, bringing in prostituted women, of which some were actually trafficked from another country. You have police officers, you have Governor Spitzer, you have actors like Hugh Grant and Charlie Sheen, union members, doctors, dentists, teachers, professionals and laborers from all walks of life, even men of the cloth. I mean, every Sunday you can watch Jimmy Swaggart, gyrate, but there's a John for you on more than one occasion. Ordinary men are at the very root of trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls worldwide. And it's because of this that governments worldwide are reticent to penalize men who feel it's their right to buy women and girls for their sexual gratification. That's why when police raid a brothel or they raid an escort service, the target is the woman, the so-called prostitute, while men, the Johns, get to walk off into the darkness, zipping up their drawers. No matter which way you examine this issue, you can't escape this one conclusion. This entire human rights calamity is totally man-made, and they are the cause of untold misery worldwide. And make no mistake about this important one fact. Men hold the key. Men hold the key to putting the brakes on this sexual insanity, because unlike the millions of women entrapped in the flesh trade, men have a choice. No one forces them to visit a brothel. No one forces them to turn a blind eye to the pathetic and devastating existence of women and girls they choose to purchase and have sex with. Men can make different choices, and those with a moral compass do. My whole drive in writing about the Natashas and now writing about the Johns on the man's side of the coin is that this whole issue boils down to one word for me, and that word is dignity. It is the dignity of all human beings on the planet. And you will not have dignity as long as you continue to allow men to do whatever they want. We send out messages every day, and one of the scariest messages that we're sending out to our young men worldwide is that if they have money in their pocket, they can go out and rent a body. And this is a message that is anathema to me, and it's something that we should be doing something about. We have to be out there looking at the demand side, going after the men, and confronting them, holding them accountable to what is going on. Because if we don't deal with demand, this is just going to get worse. We know what to do with the victims when we get them into the care situations and rescue them, but we have to deal with demand. Thank you very much.
Just add to the introduction.
Well, I don't know about any of you, but I brought my book to sign. You know, how many people multitask? And I thought I couldn't actually put it down. I don't know how many of you in this room have been in what I call the movement since the 90s. Some of you are too young for that, I see. But some of you were fighting trafficking before it was called trafficking. And I remember in the 90s, I was still a member of Congress, and I was told about some little girls in cages in India. And without going through all that, I didn't believe the exaggeration that there were people, actually over 100,000 girls and women in one area in India. Now, they do have 1 billion people, to put that in perspective, but it was hard for me to believe. And I think most of the world, including America, are in the same place. As we went along, though, some of us got it. And Shared Hope International, we do long-term restoration. Many of our girls, we've had 8, 9, 10 years, and they're from all over the world, and we restore them, put them through college, and make sure that if they want babies, they have them, and if they want to get married, they do. And so we've been really involved on that side. And that first little girl I saw, she kind of branded my heart. And I remember walking down. How many have been in India? How many have been in Mumbai? Lots of people, huh? Well, I was in that brothel area, and they're just kind of like little tiny roads, and they were showing me that very first night, maybe midnight, 2 in the morning, what I'd come to see. And it was so tight and so crowded that I had to be kind of moved through with a group of young men who had gone through a teen challenge drug program. And these were tough young guys, and they kind of circled me and moved me around through this mass. It was nearly 6 years before I realized I was walking through the problem. The problem was the men buying. That was the mass that were shopping. But many of us in the movement were not seeing it, and if we saw it, we didn't quite get it. So Shared Hope over the last 10 years, every year or two, about every year, we focus on a new country and we build capacity villages, long-term restoration. Well, just a few years ago, we had a project, actually it was prior Ambassador Lagon, and we had a project to look at trafficking markets. In fact, it was designed, look at the economics of trafficking. And so we chose 4 countries, and actually we chose 4. I added a 4th, and that didn't make some people very happy, but sometimes you just do what you have to do. The first was the Netherlands, and we know why. It had legalized prostitution. Jamaica, it was a tourist destination site. We thought mostly trafficking was for tourists. And then the third was Japan, which everyone knows has a strong cultural buyer drive where they think that men are only healthy if they have regular sex. So you had these 3 different environments, and we were going to look at them. I just kind of slipped in at the last minute a little more and decided to add America. So I looked at Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Atlanta, Georgia, and Las Vegas for similar reasons. And in that, I had thought we would find mostly individuals trafficking across borders. But what we found was undercover video and pictures of pimps, and we found people buying and selling American children. 3, 4, 5, whatever you want. And the younger they were buying, the more money they could charge. I would love to just tell you that made me excited to look at America. I just about quit. They looked like my two granddaughters, who were at that point, I have three. One was a little older. She's like 16. Two were young teens. And instead of embracing it, I wanted to not continue. Then I finally, and I have a phenomenal team here in D.C. and the people that work around the world, we finally sat down and we came to a fact. We had to take our organization and hold to all of the services around the world, because you can't deny these girls are just denied justice all over the world. They're just product. They're lesser than animals. And if we didn't continue on with them, who would? So we continue. We're developing services in Jamaica right now. But I say dramatically, we took a crayon and rubbed out trafficking markets, and we added a word, demand. And as an organization, we started looking at demand. So we did 10 more projects assessing areas in the United States for the Justice Department, some private projects, and came up with an assessment of America. Now, we're going to come out with that in a few weeks, and we're going to be standing on very solid ground of court dockets, a lot of different things where we look at arrests and lack of arrests and undercover footage, just a lot of things. But we're going to stand in America, and we're going to say, this is demand-driven. It is absolutely culturally driven, and it's your fault. You're going, my fault? I didn't do anything. It's a cultural issue. I'm going to ask you to do one thing with me. This is a little bit slower. I'm going to read you an arrest record. Now, Ambassador Hunt had a class through Harvard, and it was what is it called, a web class or? A webinar. Webinar. And there were some of us on it, and I was privileged to be on that. And we were able to ask the 400 and some people from around the nation and the world some questions. So I posed the question, and I will give this question to you. And then I'm going to read a case of an arrest and ask you what penalty the man should have. The question was, should the man, and we used male because that's predominantly what it is, although females buy, but predominantly male, buying a victim of trafficking, and we know that any child in a commercial sex venue or exchanged for benefit is a traffic victim, right? Under 18. So, should a man buying a domestic minor sex traffic victim, which is the coin term for trafficking of children, should he get the same penalty as the seller? Should he get more? A little bit less, or just none at all? It's really not his fault. If the guy wasn't selling, he wouldn't have to buy. So write those down or think of them. I'll give them to you again. I'll tell you later kind of the numbers that came out of that. A lot of people answered. So I put that same poll online after I was on it was after Dr. Phil, I think. So I put the same poll online and drove people to it. And I don't know, thousands, lots of other people took the poll. They were similar to the Harvard. So I'm going to give you a case, and you tell me what penalty this man should have. This is the officer's report after he's brought the criminal in. And it says, I'm a peace officer being employed for a period of 8 years and 9 months that I learned the following facts and circumstances which lead me to believe that the above-named subject committed the above offenses at the location listed. On 9/8/2006, at approximately 21:04 hours, Sergeant Smith, and I'm changing the names, this because I just don't want to get involved in this case right now and talk about it further than this. Sergeant Smith and I, Officer Jones, were working in plain clothes in an unmarked vehicle. We were pulling out of the parking garage, and we saw a blue Dodge pickup bearing, and it gives the license plate, driving slowly up the road, and I won't give the road. I saw a black female juvenile that was later identified as Jennifer Johnson, and I've changed her name. She was walking northbound on the east side of the street when the Dodge truck slowed down and Johnson waved at the vehicle and then walked up to the passenger side door. The passenger side window was down. It looked like she was talking to the driver. The truck then slowly traveled, approaching another street. Through my training and experience, I know that this is a common practice for prostitution-related crimes. The truck then impeded traffic by stopping in the right lane just south of the traffic signal at Carson Street. Johnson then walked up to the passenger side window for approximately 20 to 30 seconds, and it appeared that she was having a conversation with the driver. Johnson opened the passenger side door of the vehicle and got in the front passenger side seat. The vehicle then turned and they proceeded. I won't take you along this path. I noticed that there was a rear tail lamp out, and so I activated my siren. The vehicle continued eastbound and then turned southbound. The vehicle then pulled over. I made contact with the driver. I asked him for his license and registration and insurance. The driver handed me blah, blah, blah. He actually didn't have some of those things. Sergeant Smith had Jennifer Johnson step out of the vehicle, and she told Sergeant that she was looking for a ride to her sister's house. She said that she recognized Robertson as someone that used to work with her brother. Then she changed her story several times and then told the sergeant that she was selling him sex, and she wanted $40 for it. She said that after she got in the truck, she said she stroked Robertson's penis 2 times with her hand and then noticed our emergency lights and stopped. Due to the above facts and circumstances and making agreement for $40, as well as Robertson, as well as Robertson had $45 in U.S. currency hanging from his left front pocket of his pants, and Robertson had lotion on both of his hands. Okay? They were involved in various sex acts even when he was driving the car. The question is, her birthday, I forgot that. Her birthday was 3/19/96. His birthday was 11/4/59. Yep. 12 and 48. Okay. Is this child a traffic victim? There's a commercial transaction. Did you have to see the pimp? No. She cannot give consent to her own victimization. And we know 12-year-olds can't survive on the street anyway. So what kind of a penalty? Should he, and I'm going to start on a matrix, should he get the same penalty that the pimp got? How many believe that? A few of you. Yeah. I don't know that this is science, and it's hard, isn't it? How many think he should get more? Okay. How many a little less, but to get a penalty? How many think he should get no penalty at all? And how many are totally confused by that? Yeah. Now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. This was the child's arrest. We're going to be delivering the arrest records and the proof that we're arresting children, 12, 13, 14, all over the United States. And even though they say we're doing surveillance and we're using decoys, the kids aren't with us, so we can't arrest them or we can't prove intent. We will be proving the kids are arrested and the men that buy them are not. There is no deterrent in the United States effectively against buying. Now, there's some hope on the horizon. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which I'm sure Ambassador Lagon will be talking about, was modified last year. The word obtain within the law says anybody obtaining a traffic victim, they're also culpable for being involved in trafficking. They have been saying that you had to prove intent, etc. I've always said there's a lot of other laws you can use. If that same man molested that 12-year-old in the neighborhood, he'd be up for a long time. He'd be a sex offender, right? If he were a teacher, and even if she was 15, 16, 17, jail, right? The only thing that changed in the United States, and is similar all over the world, is once there's money transferred, she is stripped of her dignity, stripped of her rights, and she becomes the criminal. We'll be releasing this in a few weeks, but I'm glad you're here, and I'm very excited about the focus flipping to demand. It took some of us a while. Not that I didn't know it was serious, but I was just so tied up in figuring out what to do with those little girls. But now we know, wouldn't it be much better to work upstream, fighting demand upstream? So Victor Ambassador Hunt, thank you for doing this today, and I just look forward to working with all of you.
Well, many thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to Ambassador Hunt for bringing us together to talk about a really important subject. It's a pleasure to be here with former colleagues from the diplomatic world and especially colleagues from civil society world. Thank you for taking the time to come today. In my experience as the ambassador to combat human trafficking, we were trying to take direction from Congress and the will of the left and the right together in a consensus that we begin to look at the question of demand as a driver for sex trafficking in the world. One searing experience from my travels to 28 countries in my tenure was to Kenya. I visited the beautiful coastal city of Mombasa in Kenya, and there I, among other things, met with hoteliers to try and get their help as a corporate actor to try and clean up the places where people would become sex tourists, to change the situation of demand. With a Kenyan national who worked for the American Embassy, I went in Mombasa to a club, and with his help, building the trust of a young girl in the club, I heard the story of the sex trade. The girl said she was 18. I couldn't imagine she was older than 16 looking at her. And she told the story of how many like her came from the interior of Kenya looking for a better life. And she told of how she took man after man to the basement of that club she worked in hopes of economic reward and perhaps someone whisking her away from that situation with marriage. I thought of many people who I'd heard of around the world who'd had those hopes dashed. During that same trip, I went out to dinner just for fun with my colleagues and saw at a restaurant a German man with on one side a woman who looked like she had to be his wife, and on the other side a young Kenyan woman who was obviously there as a sex partner. And I thought to myself, this is a particularly droll face of demand, but this is the face of demand. There have been efforts around the world to fight demand. The Chileans have put in place tougher law enforcement, particularly aimed at those who are so-called customers of the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Unfortunately, that same kind of law enforcement isn't aimed in Chile, a human rights-loving country, isn't aimed at adults. Some countries are trying to address demand by shaming. In the last year that statistics were collected, South Korea took 15,000 Johns arrested and gave them sensitivity training, so-called John schools, to highlight the possibility that they were in fact fueling sex trafficking. And awareness campaigns have been pursued all over the world, including, to their credit, with a good deal of money put into it by Denmark. Those same kinds of efforts on demand, law enforcement, shaming, and awareness, have been tried in the last couple of years while I was ambassador to combat human trafficking and chairing the interagency group that Ambassador Hunt referred to. In law enforcement, I think one of the most impressive cases I've heard about is the recent prosecution in Kansas City of men who were using children in prostitution without a pimp in the picture. They were the so-called customers. And yet they're being prosecuted under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act for sex trafficking. That should deter demand. Shaming occurs in a number of places, including the billboards in Nebraska announcing the names of Johns arrested. And awareness has been raised in such things as Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin's campaign, which she calls the Dear John campaign, to highlight the problem of how demand leads to trafficking in the public, and of course John schools. John schools that have been pursued in the United States and found to work, including one John school that Victor and I both attended in San Francisco, and he describes in great detail in his book, The Johns. It was actually a real treat because we saw a true hero of the anti-trafficking movement, Norma Hotelling, a former woman in prostitution, give her very last talk to a John school, a pioneer in raising the question, what about the men? She said, so many people look at a community of a city and they look at those so-called dirty women in prostitution, and it's as if the men who are trying to buy them are invisible. She's right. Now, Congresswoman Smith is right to note that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act has been refined, updated, strengthened. The version of the bill that was enacted in December of last year does a few things that help us on the front of demand. For instance, in a brilliant idea in our left-right coalition of NGOs, suggested by Concerned Women for America, the FBI's uniform crime reports that are gathered in the states now require breaking down the arrests in the area of prostitution by pimps, johns, and prostituted people, so that you can tell what we know is true, that the vast majority of those arrested in that world of sexual exploitation are the women, the potential victims. That's a baseline we desperately need. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act also insists on a study from the Department of Justice about internet-based crimes in the sex industry, and insists that the Department of Justice report on why it hasn't fulfilled a requirement under a 2005 law to produce a study of the commercial sex industry in America, a study that's supposed to look at the unlawful commercial sex industry, study the nature of johns, and look at different modes of sex trafficking in massage parlors, pimp-controlled street prostitution, internet-based sex industries, and brothels. And on the international front, a reform in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is to create a standalone benchmark for the international report that's so famous and so indigestion-inspiring among some of our colleagues around the world. It took a provision that existed that emphasizes what sustained efforts by countries are being made to reduce demand for commercial sex and for sex tourism, and makes that a separated out, dedicated minimum standard for how countries will be ranked. That report is controversial by giving grades to other countries, but it does spur constructive discussion and spur constructive cooperation, awkward as it is. I was also asked by our host today to offer some suggestions on where we ought to go on demand. I've had the luck to move to a wonderful organization, Polaris Project, which is in large part focused on the United States and on advanced industrial countries where one sees demand. And let me say, here are my thoughts and those of our team at Polaris. We need to focus on education, not just John schools, not just the after-the-fact sensitivity training, but we need to look to educate boys and men, both formally and informally, not just in school, but by others, celebrities, fathers, friends, teaching. We need to have male leaders and role models. What we would do for those who were part of the hip-hop culture to note that a pimp is not a hero, is not hip, but is in fact a violent exploiter. But that would come much more effectively from people who are in the entertainment industry rather than someone like me who might be seen as just tut-tutting. And we need harsher laws, penalties for those who purchase sex. We need to understand the distinctions between types of Johns, to understand that, as Victor says, there is a general problem, that there are double standards, that men are somehow treated like they can have desires and act on them and turn it into an act of capitalism and buy. But we should look at the different types, the hobbyist John, the recreational John, the sex addict John, the various kinds that his hair-raising book gives you a taxonomy of. We need men who have previously been Johns and seen the light. In John schools, including that which is run in the District of Columbia, the people who are there constantly are asking for that. They want that legitimate voice of people who have been Johns to speak to it. And we need cultural change. I've got to say, we need to look for fathers in every setting, including in urban settings, to have an impact, because there could be a great impact if men take responsibility for teaching younger males. And we need to think about hypersexualization in our society. I'm no prude. My good friends will tell you I'm no prude. But we need to think in the ways that women are objectified. Boys are acculturated very early in society, from the inner city to the most lily-white, affluent suburb. Boys are taught early by our culture, by our television, by internet, by everyone, to judge a woman by how she looks. And we just need to think that the degradation of women, to think of them as objects, think about it, something which might be worthy of being sold, as opposed to treating them like fully human beings, not eligible for sale, is a place to begin. I don't believe that capitalism necessarily means that women and girls and children need to be put on sale. But absent our doing something about this demand, it can happen. Thank you.
Okay, you all. I've just learned there are 40 people in the overflow room. And so I would like to focus on them. But as I'm waiting for questions from you are you there? Are they there? Can you see me? They can't see me. You can see me. Hi. We're so glad you're here. We are so glad you're here. So you will be very active in creating questions, okay? Good. Meanwhile, let's hear it. Let's see the hands. Yes, please. And would you say who you are, please?
Okay.
And
we'll
a
ask
mic
you to
is
speak in a microphone.
Mike is racing over to you so our overflow group can hear you too.
Hello, my name is Lisa Thompson. I'm with the Salvation Army National Headquarters. Wonderful panel. Thank you so much for your comments. It's been very informative, and it's exciting that we're having this discussion on demand. And this is kind of just a general issue I kind of want to frame for any of the panelists to comment to. I feel like the discussion on demand that we actually, at this point, even need to go upstream on that conversation, because and Mark, you started to do that, I think, especially in your last closing comments there. But we often speak about demand as if it's somehow spontaneously emerging in a vacuum, when yet I really believe that there is a script that is, as you say, acculturating and grooming men to become buyers. And Victor, you made a couple comments. You talked about men wanting perverted sex acts and going to women in prostitution to get those sex acts. And you talked about, but yet they weren't men watching porn in basements. Well, they're not watching it in basements. They're watching it in their office computer, in their living room late at night when the wife is upstairs in bed. So I think what I'm trying to say is that this is really part of a continuum, this fight against demand for commercial sex as expressed in prostitution. And unless we really flesh out the outlines of this elephant in the room, which starts with the big P word that nobody likes to talk about anymore because it's not cool, I don't think we're going to be very effective. And that big P word is pornography. And our failure to have addressed and really fought that issue and to talk about the dignity of women and how they're debased in pornography, how they're objectified in pornography, this is what it's wrought. This mammoth demand that, it's going to take all of us fighting tooth and nail to ever bring it back. And generations of young men being, taught that this is how you view women, this is what they expect in sex, all this degradation, all this harm. So I just like to, maybe you could talk about the pornography word and just what are your thoughts and how do you see it playing into demand?
And particularly since we are in a public policy arena here, if you could talk about the challenges, the successes, what is the experience of public policy makers around this issue? Any of you?
Sure. In the John's book, at one point I wasn't even going to deal with pornography, and because it had not connected in my brain, because I don't watch pornography. I listened to Gail Dines speak about pornography in New York City a couple of years ago, and that's the first time in any speech where my armpits actually sweat. I couldn't believe what she was saying was on the internet and what kind of pornography was out there. It is XXX. It is horrifying. It chills an adult male to the bone. However, 8, 9, and 10-year-old boys whose fingers just tap on the computers are seeing this stuff every day, and you have to ask yourself, what is that doing to their brain cells? It's frying them. And by the time they reach 11, 12, 13, and they're starting to have relationships with young women in their high schools, what are they thinking of them? Because this stuff is so degrading, so dehumanizing, so disgusting that you have to wonder why anyone would want to call it artistic freedom or freedom of speech or whatever. Because we have these civil libertarian idiots out there who seem to think that anyone has a right to watch what they want without asking themselves, who are these women? And look at their eyes, look at their faces and the pain and the suffering that they're going through so they can, entertain some perverted individual out there. We have to start looking at the internet and challenging what it is that, we seem to freely put out there for 13 and 14 and 8 and 9-year-old boys to watch. This is scary stuff. And there has to be a very serious debate in society about what it is that we permit. However, we've got to get parents involved to start saying, what are you watching on the internet in those, in your closed room with your friends or on your laptop, in wireless cafes or whatever? This stuff is unbelievable. It has nothing to do with creativity. It has nothing to do with artistic freedom. And it certainly has nothing to do with freedom of speech. It has everything to do with degradation, dehumanization of women. And it's torture in so much of the cases that I've seen.
Just a couple of comments. At the State Department, there was this stereotype that the office I led on human trafficking was this forward-leaning vanguard, and the specialists in the regional bureaus were trying to hold us back. Let's not wreck our relationship with our allies around the world, talking only about human trafficking. But in working with one of our closest allies, Japan, it was, in fact, the young, forward-leaning regional specialist in our embassy in Tokyo who said, among the things that we're raising with the government of Japan, you've got to raise the issue of pornography for children in this society because it's a driver. And it was a real insight, and it didn't come from the idealistic specialists of the Human Trafficking Office, but indeed someone whose job it was to cultivate a relationship with the host government. It's one reason I'm glad that Polaris has an office in Tokyo, because we have a niche not in the developing world, but in fact the advanced industrial countries. Victor's point is right about our thinking about free speech. I'm a deep believer in freedom of expression as special, to the United States. But not only do I agree with Lisa about pornography being part and parcel of the demand problem, but I've been seized with Craigslist and how commercial sex is for sale on erotic services sections of Craigslist in every city in the United States. And ostensibly, Craigslist is fighting for the freedom for people to meet and barter and engage in commerce with each other. But there's just a question that arises: if sex is for sale, which is illegal in almost every county of the United States, isn't it a hazard? Why is it still going on? Maybe a few sting operations gets pursued, but we should be able to set some limits because this is the new frontier, internet-based sale of women and girls.
It's interesting because what if Craigslist was offering sites for heroin? I mean, is there actually a legal difference? You know, if both of them are illegal to purchase?
It's definitely being debated. It's definitely a part of the debate of why is a drug more important than the life of a child. So it's a very interesting debate. You know, I was thinking of the girls that I've interviewed over the years, and for 10 years we've done some pretty in-depth work with girls, so I have them longer. And I don't separate a child trafficked and used or a woman used in pornography from one that is used in commercial sex, stripping, what you would consider normal sale of a person by the hour, renting her. What we find all over the world, whatever country as well as whatever city in the United States, is that most girls, especially the first experiences when they're young, have been videoed. They've had pictures. And so it's like in manufacturing, we call it value added. There's a little piece of something that you make some money off of that is cut off the end of the log in Washington State. That little piece is of more value than the actual log. We call it value added. Well, pornography is just a byproduct of rape. It's just a byproduct of victimization. There really isn't any difference. And so what we found, though, is there's a change. And the change is this. We are arresting more for what we would call pornography. It's easier to catch, and there's some aggressiveness there, and that should continue. What we're calling for, though, is as many arrests of actually buying and selling traffic victims as there are of pornographic sales.
I remember when I was working on my third book, there was a chapter, it's not out yet, it's from Duke University Press, and there was a chapter on rape in Bosnia, and so I was checking some statistics, and I Googled Bosnia rape, and what came up is watch Bosnian women being raped. You know. Yeah. Okay, Ekaterina Osipova, Russian Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, Reagan Fassel Democracy Program. To all the panelists, please, what is your opinion about the development of the demand in the situation of the financial crisis, less salary, more unemployment of males, etc.? Will the human trafficking increase or decrease?
There are indications in the Czech Republic and other countries that it has decreased. Poor guys don't have enough money, you know, and I feel so sorry for them, you know. But the financial crisis has led to a decrease, but it also has led to pimps and brothel owners really lowering the prices and forcing young women into really horrific situations as well.
I just say one wonders whether the sex industry is recession-proof if it's something that people don't end up spending less on in rough economic times. I don't know the answer to that question. But I do think that the vulnerability of people to become trafficking victims remains intense because economic desperation, while not the singular cause of human trafficking, is an important one. I think, you know, without the demand, without the corrupt official, without the trafficker who's cruel and sadistic, you wouldn't have it. But if economic desperation is increased for some people, I think their vulnerability is also increased.
There are some signs, I think, that we're already seeing, like in Las Vegas. And we know that, well, one of our partners identified 400 children being prostituted, traffic victims in 1 month in Las Vegas. There is something about people traveling. They're cutting their business travel. Their corporations are cutting back. So people that travel, that is decreasing, and we're seeing that in different environments where we work. The interesting thing that we found in the demand report, and you can get that online by going to Shared Hope's site and just go into the word demand and go in. You can get the video, some of the undercover, as well as a report. But what we find is that where there's an acceptance without any penalty, even if it's not legal, that the local buyers increase because they fit in. There's no pushback. There's no problem with that. So we find buying at home appears to be growing. Now, you know, buyers don't report and bad guys don't report, and little kids and women that are vulnerable can't. But the other indicator we're finding is that as the borders are tightening, that the same coyotes that were going across into Mexico are now shopping in the migrant communities of unempowered girls who are maybe with illegal families or maybe just kids along the border. And they're moving their quotas like into New Orleans, which isn't very far from local girls. And as you would know, many foster care systems are not strong in the United States, and so they don't go missing. So I think that really, if you can buy and you want to buy and you've got money, you'll probably just shift to buying closer to home unless they're putting men who buy in jail or pushing back somewhere in your community.
Yes.
I'm Pauline Muchina, and
Will you stand up?
sure. My name is Pauline Muchina, and my question is, as I look around the room, majority of us are women, and we are not the ones who need talking to. It's the men who need talking to. And this is not the first meeting I have seen this. I've seen it repeatedly. Every meeting that I have been to, there will be maybe 5 men, and then the rest of us is women. So my question to the 2 male panelists, you know, how did you get involved, and how can we get more men involved in this? And especially considering that the majority of policymakers in the world are men. And to add on that, these men, I come from Kenya, where having, you know, multiple partners for men is acceptable. So, and also selling women in dowry or bride price, you know, that's acceptable. So the issue of selling one's body is not a huge jump from where we are culturally. And so how do you begin to deal with the cultural aspect of it to connect it to the policy aspect of it? Thanks.
My involvement comes from my history as a child growing up in the child welfare system in Quebec, in a very Dickensian system where I lived in foster homes, then boys' homes, then detention centers. I saw how children were abused. I was the subject of a lot of physical abuse in these homes. When I became a journalist in 1970, I started to look at child abuse issues, the very weak end of the spectrum who can't stand for themselves. I later also began to look at senior citizens, the other end of the spectrum of people who can't stand for themselves. When I started hearing about trafficked women in the year 2000 and worked on the book on the Natashas, I realized that, you know, something has to be done, because this is literally international sexual terrorism against women in the world. Someone has to stand, and oftentimes the people who have to stand have to be the men to go after the men, because every time I've heard women getting up and speaking, they've told me later that the men would laugh at them and call them feminazis, lesbians, men haters, and all kinds of things. I am now talking to a lot of groups to bring men forward to get involved in the dialogue. If men don't get involved in this dialogue, we have a problem. So I've gone to high schools in Canada, in the United States, in England, and talked directly to boys, and talked to them about relationships, about love, about what sexual relationships mean, about what dignity means and what equality means in our society. That it's not a manly thing to go out there and think because you're a man you're entitled, and because you have money in your pocket you're entitled to rent a body. This is going to be one heck of an uphill battle to get men involved. I have been on a number of radio talk shows, and Johns are great at being anonymous. They hide behind the miniskirts of the prostituted woman. They let her front everything. These guys are cowards, but boy, when they come after me, they come after me. Except they get very surprised because I can respond very quickly to them in a language that they understand. But we have to start a dialogue among men. And that is starting. It's slow, but I would suspect that within a year or two, you're going to see a really big change in the kind of conferences that are being held in North America and in Europe, with a lot of men attending and men talking to each other about this.
Anyone else? You don't need to. Okay. Very important voice here first from the overflow room. I'm going to combine two. Now, one is Helen Foray with the UN Information Center in Washington, who says, does anyone in the panel believe that legalization of the sex industry is a solution? And then related to that, and I think very powerful, I am a sex worker. Our voices are not represented here. Sex workers are part of the solution to ending trafficking. Our clients are being misrepresented and villainized. The exchange of cash for sex is not in and of itself exploitative. Poverty is central. We all seem to agree about that. But to conflate consensual, underscored twice, sex with rape and trafficking compromises our efforts for real, effective change. Sure.
Man. I think what's important when we talk about this question of legalization is to distinguish what we're talking about. I really think that it would be a terrible mistake to support legalization for the trafficker, the pimp, the so-called customer, the John. I think we need to turn around the situation in which prostituted people, and you'll note you'll never catch me referring to a prostitute, but prostituted person, they should not be punished and stigmatized. I think that what the Swedes do with their formula of decriminalizing prostituted people so that the woman is not disproportionately punished and stigmatized is the right approach. But it's a mistake. And, you know, if you read this book, read what the mayor of Amsterdam has said about the experiment in the Netherlands about trying to legalize the pimps and the Johns. He says it doesn't work. That's why he's been taking the steps he's been taking to shrink the red light district of Amsterdam. And, you know, bless Mayor Cohen for saying that. I think choice is very important to look at in a clear light, because so often meaningful choice is lost for women and girls in the sex industry. There's forced prostitution, there's fraud and manipulation, there's violence, there's indebtedness used to control, and so one really needs to scratch below the surface and ask the question, is there meaningful choice? We shouldn't be patronizing. We shouldn't try to redeem women somehow that we, you know, secretly in our hearts think are dirty. We should help them empower themselves. But it's essential to realize that choice is sometimes a mirage.
You know, I was thinking as we've gone around the world, we've investigated legal and tolerated venues. So we took and compared Amsterdam and Las Vegas. And we looked at where it was tolerated by law or by the lack of application of law. It's not legal in Las Vegas, but they let them pass out sales pamphlets all over the street and actually have magazines. Where it's tolerated, it creates an environment where the product can be victimized. What we found in any place where they tolerate it, they will not put the number of law enforcement there to even keep it safe. I think Amsterdam, we could identify maybe 6 or 7 police, and it was under-enforced. And even then, my question is, when there are doors and they shut and there's curtains that are pulled, how do you even keep it as safe as a kitchen that we can inspect with a health worker? It cannot. It's a facade to believe you can keep it medically safe. You just simply cannot. You might minimize the damage. The other thing that is so very important that we discovered is that where there is an acceptance, there's an increase in demand, there's more buying of locals, and there needs to be more product. And because there are only a very few adult women who choose to become prostituted or to prostitute themselves as adults, our decision, or my decision, it took me about 3 or 4 years to come to it, was that, like any law, we have them to protect the innocent. And because it has become a place, a prostitution tolerated or legalized, where we create an environment for trafficked women and children to be sold, that we as a society have to clean up any place where there would be people victimized. Therefore, I have come out against legalized prostitution because it does not work. And at the same time, we have to have options and programs, just like we have other types of job options for people when a certain kind of industry goes away. For those women who are in prostitution, I think we as a society need to give them something that we offer. We have a program at Shared Hope, and we offer retraining, and we offer help, and we offer shelter. But we don't accept that that is a place of dignity for any woman in the world to be used and sold to men. We won't accept that. And for you women and for you that said that you're in prostitution, I think we probably just disagree. But if you would like to call me, I would love to help you find something else. And you're going to find that just a little bit irritating when you hear me say that. But I believe that I've never met a woman yet that when she could have a dignified job would not choose that than laying down for men after men. So, strong opinion, but there it is.
I've looked at this issue of legalization. I've got a chapter called A Gift to Johns, because that's all legalization is. I've looked at every question that the happy hooker lobby has put out, which is a load of claptrap, and you take it down one after the other. Organized crime does not leave. Why would you leave a multi-billion-dollar business? Health aspects do not get solved. When you look at the safety issues, they do not get solved. They may get reduced. They call it harm reduction. Well, what job do you have or career opportunity do you have out there where the harm reduction is, well, instead of getting beaten up 18 times a month, it might be 6. Instead of 200 being murdered a year, it might be 100. Harm reduction is not an answer to anything. And when they talk about safety in these places and they put a panic button up in illegal brothels, the only place that should have a panic button is a nuclear power plant or a federal penitentiary, not a brothel. And the every argument that I have heard from the happy hooker lobby has failed. And when they talk about empowerment, there is only one person who has the power, the guy with the money. There's no such thing as empowerment of women in prostitution. It's the guy with the money who has the power. He calls the shots.
Okay, it's happened. Now it's happened. Well, there are probably 12 people who would like to speak now. I am going to choose 2, and I'm going to ask you to, I see your hands, and I'm going to ask the panelists to make no more than a 2-sentence response. I'll tell you what, I'll choose 3. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Anna Forbes. I work for the Global Campaign for Microbicides. I'm one of the idiots that believes in free speech. So I have a couple of things to say, one of which is that I think that using disparaging terms like the happy hooker lobby for people with whom you don't agree politically might not be the wisest way to forge consensus. The second is that I think we need to make a big differentiation between decriminalization and legalization. I also have serious issues with legalization. I think that there is an argument to be made for the fact that decriminalization puts a different situation forward, and unfortunately there's not enough time really to go into the discussion here on that. But I would also just like to point out for future panels on this that I think there is a real absence by not having someone who self-identifies as a sex worker on this panel. It is once again removing women's rights to speak for themselves about their own profession and instead having other people speak for them. So I hope that in future sessions that omission might be corrected.
Thank you so much, and I will ensure that that is true, okay? And I especially appreciate the person who wrote the note in that respect. In the corner, yes, sir?
Sorry. I just have a comment. My name is Ken Ramirez. I haven't worked in anti-trafficking for a while, but I worked in Phoenix for the Arizona League to End Regional Trafficking, and I was the outreach worker there. We focused on labor trafficking, but I did work with Catholic Charities, and they had a lot of work with prostitutions and trying to get women out of the streets. And my comment is for the average age for prostitution is 12 years old in this country. So if, when people are saying of legalizing of prostitution not being a victimless crime, if average age is 12 years old and you think about the cognitive development and the brain development of a 12-year-old, of a child, then you can assert that they are being coerced, they are being forced. So even if you have a 30-year-old woman that is a prostitute that says, I'm doing this for myself, most likely she started being a prostitute when she was a kid, when she was a teenager. So she's a victim. Maybe throughout the process, throughout the years, maybe she doesn't remember, she doesn't think so. But I think it's important to keep in mind that average age is 12 years old, and if we don't do anything about, I haven't done much in trafficking, but I'm like already tense. It's been over a year, almost 2 years, and I just hear this, and I just get enraged again. And there's a lot of things that we can do just as regular people. If we're not involved in anti-trafficking, everywhere we go, we need to be looking. We need to use our cell phones to call the police. If we think something is fishy, we just call. There's nothing wrong. If we don't want to get involved, we can call from our car, we can call far away, but we need to do something about it.
Thank you. And I think maybe the statistic is that that's the average age of entry into prostitution, as I recall. You know what? I'm afraid that we do have to stop, and let me ask for a last comment related to what you've just heard, or as you would want to wrap this up, and then I'll say one last word.
I've talked to a lot of prostituted women, especially trafficked women in Europe and in different parts of the world. The tragedies that I've seen, the stories that I've heard, make me want to go out and do something about this. Legalization is not going to work. It doesn't work. It has not worked in any country that I've looked at. It entraps more women, it ensnares more women, and it brings the demand up to an insatiable level, making the traffickers and the pimps hunt down more and more young women to meet this insatiable demand. I think we have to look at this issue as a human rights issue and go after it, because this whole question comes down really to dignity of women in our society.
Thank you.
Well, I'd say if there was an omission from this panel, that the omission is the victim of sex trafficking. That's next time I come here, I hope that's who gets added to the panel. Find someone who's speaking for women in prostitution. But I really think that's what we need to hear from. When I traveled to Mexico 3 times in my tenure at the Department of State, I went to Chiapas, and I asked the International Organization for Migration if I could meet a victim of trafficking, presumably someone coming from Central America. And I met a young woman in Tapachula in Chiapas, and she was a Mexican, hadn't crossed a border. That's the kind of person telling that story who would add to this excellent panel. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm just glad we're talking about demand. This has been phenomenal. 10 years ago, I didn't see it. 15 years ago, nobody saw it. And so I commend the organizers, all of you that work so hard to get the right people in the room. I'm going to leave you with this and add an appeal to my colleague, the two beside me, that I think that we, as a society, need to get those that were victimized, the survivors, who are empowered and actually running programs here. Because what we found in creating model programs is our survivor group, our roundtable, is the one that's helping us understand how to keep a woman or a girl safe enough so she can heal enough to be able to grow and to heal. I think that survivor-led networks are something that I would love to see be next. And again, Swanee, this is, Ambassador.
Please.
There's so many ambassadors here.
My friends call me Madam, it's okay.
Madam, excuse me. I would bow, but I think that you would be embarrassed. But thank you very much.
Sure. Listen, I first of all, I feel like, how could I do this? How could I put together a panel and not be thinking more about the diversity of voices here? I apologize to everyone. I actually am a firm believer in, although sometimes I'm blind. And I also am embarrassed that we are all white people, four Caucasians here talking about a problem that is actually deep, not just internationally, but in our own communities, deeply affects the Black and Hispanic and other Asian, etc. To the person who wrote about being a sex worker, I am a member of the ACLU. I'm a big supporter of the ACLU, and I believe in free speech, and so I end up in this bind. And so I want to acknowledge that just like there is a range of the guys who are the Johns, all the way from, I know, really, really nice guy who it does all kinds, he's on the board of all kinds of NGOs and et cetera, and he's a John. And you get this whole range to really sadistic perpetrators, and so there's that whole range, and there's also a range among the women and those who came onto the streets when they were 12 years old, runaways, et cetera, who get picked up within 36 hours. And then, at what point is it a free choice? On their 18th birthday, they somehow are making a free choice, whereas, when they were 17, they weren't. It's just, you get into some bizarre situations. So here's where I come out. Quite a few years ago, almost 150 years ago, the United States of America made a decision. And we decided, we have all kinds of economic reasons to be supporting slavery. It is a tradition, it's our culture, frankly. And we are taking care of a lot of people with the slavery. I'm from the South, by the way. And so I would hear stories of my grandmother about the beloved slaves, in the family. And but then the country, said, "Oh no, we don't want to be a country that buys other people, it owns." Yeah, but this is really our culture. It's not. Oh yeah, I know, but and we went back and forth, so much so that how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed in that war, the Civil War. And there were all kinds of slaves in the South who said, "You know what? Actually, my family has been with this family for generations, and it's worked out very well. We are treated with dignity. My children have been educated. I have health care. They feed me well. Please, I just as soon not change it." And we said, "Well, but the problem is you're the exception. And so for the sake of others, we're going to limit, in fact, the rights of people to own slaves, and we're going to limit the rights of people to be slaves, even to be slaves, because we've decided that the system as a whole is so damaging. And that's not who we want to be as a country." I just leave you with that thought. I hope that those of you who are energized about this will take a next step. I hope you will go to Shared Hope, to their website. I hope you will go to the Polaris website. I hope you will purchase the Johns, and not just for yourself, but send it out to other people. And please don't do this thing where you tell him later, oh, I bought your book and I'm giving it to my sister now that I've read it. Please buy 2 copies, okay? I want to tell you, as an author, how many people say that to me, and we've passed it among 4 of us. And I say, oh, all right, if it's worth it to you, then buy multiple copies. All right, you all, thank you so much for coming.